Welcome to the Reel to Reel podcast, where the stories behind the board go on record. I'm your host, Bruce Hensal, and we're here to give an insider's look at the music industry. I'm joined by my co-host, Chase, from the Melrose audio team.
Hey, doing good.
We're in 3 separate locations, including the audio studio in the Melrose Center of the Orlando Public Library. Today's guest is Emmy Award-winning sound mixer Joe Foglia. Joe's an old friend going all the way back to our time at Criteria Studios in Miami during the late 70s and early 80s. Please welcome our guest, Joe Foglia. Hey, Joe.
Hey, how is everybody?
Doing well.
Yeah, same.
Good. Nice to meet you all. Good seeing you again, Bruce.
Good to see you again, Joe. I wanted to start and talk a little bit about when we first met. It was at Criteria Studios in Miami. As I recall, it was a Terry Brooks session, the first thing we had done.
I believe it was, and I think it was over in Studio C on the opposite end of the building. Yeah, I was looking for his album this morning, trying to find it, and it's just kind of buried because I just moved a lot of things around. But yeah, it was some great pictures on the back because he always did that collage thing.
He did.
Yeah.
And he was one of the first guys I remember doing colored vinyl, too.
Yeah.
He would release them. Who was it? Dick somebody at Alpha
Audio or
Alpha. Yeah, they were the pressing plant in Fort Lauderdale.
Right.
And I remember one session Terry did where we recorded it, mixed it, John Blanche mastered it, and we sent it off, and they had a pressing the next day. And I think Terry got in the Guinness Book of World Records for the quickest vinyl turnaround on a record.
If I remember correctly, how long were we in the studio to do the whole album? It was very quick, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was no more than 2 days for the entire album. So
You
good
well
luck
rehearsed.
with that. Exactly. Well, and then we did some remotes together too. I recall at Criteria.
Yeah, we did. We did. I think it was the Outlaws or Jay Ferguson because Joe Walsh showed up at Miami. Right. What was the name of that theater in Miami? Gusman Hall, and it was a very small theater. And right. Jay Ferguson came out with his album. I don't know if you worked on Jay's album or not, but
I did. I worked on both All Alone in the End Zone. I worked on that when I was at the record plant in Los Angeles.
Right.
And then he worked at Bill's studios, Bill Simzik's Bayshore Recording in Miami. So I didn't work on the Miami portion of that record.
Though I do remember doing a remote with him at Gusman. I think it was to promote that. That was a very small venue and such. But I believe we met then. There was a whole preamble to that whole thing because I used to do remotes before I went to Criteria with a studio truck that I built that had dual 24 tracks. And then I left that organization and came to Criteria, and then I think about a year later, Mac Emmerman, our fearless leader at Criteria, wanted his own remote truck because he was into doing a lot of jazz recordings. Now, I don't remember, did you do any of the jazz? Because I used to go in and set up the clubs, the jazz clubs in Miami. Mac used to come in. I think you sort of set up the engineering and then he sat down at the board. I don't quite remember all of that. That was way far long ago.
I don't think at that time I was doing that many remotes with Mac.
Okay.
I do remember you and I coming up here to Orlando to record Terry at the old Fern Park station.
Yep. Yeah, he was a big hit in Castleberry, right?
He was at Castleberry and Italy. He was quite well known over there as a a Martian heavy metal guitarist.
Yeah, and he definitely did have all of the heavy metal stuff going on back then too, with his whole rigs, and a lot of that stuff hasn't changed that much from back then till today.
Yep, that's true. Well, I kind of wanted to talk about your transition into film and television. Now, did you work for Ivan Tors on any of the Flipper stuff?
No, I'm not quite that old, fortunately. But I used to watch it on TV.
Yeah.
But there was a studio. Well, from Criteria, I transitioned into the film industry because it started slowing down a lot when they introduced the CDs. Digital music was on its way in, and things kind of slowed down quite a bit in the studio, and we were all curious on where it was going to go. A lot of guys stuck with it. I kind of had an opportunity to go into filmmaking, sound for filmmaking, in production sound, and not necessarily post sound. Whereas a lot of people who have studios or worked in studios transition into post production versus production. So I kind of went the production route from Criteria, and then I did a slow crossover fade into the industry, then which I kind of was the only guy in Miami. There was a handful, I think 3 guys, and I was one of the 3, and I fortunately found it to be more interesting for me, because every day it's a new location, a new challenge, a new acoustical problem, what mics to use. And I adapted a lot of the things I learned from you, Bruce. I worked with Chuck Kirkpatrick and Steve Gursky, a lot of these great engineers. Jerry Masters from Memphis, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, was hooked up with Dr. Hook, and which I worked with Jerry on that. So I had the benefit of learning so much at Criteria as an assistant, and I enjoyed working as an assistant more so than I did as an engineer, because I learned so many different tricks from different guys. Nowadays, I realize a lot of people just want to jump into it, and I feel like you miss so much by jumping into it and not becoming an assistant. I was there way ahead of the session time, and I was, ended up staying way after. My days were like 20 hours a day. Sometimes you end up crashing in one of the studios that weren't being used, or on a couch someplace. You always found a little corner or someplace behind a gobo to catch some Z's and get up and start working again. But when you get put on projects for a long period, it's great. And I was fortunate enough to work on a Black Sabbath album with Ronnie James Dio all the way through, and that was about maybe 3 or 4 months, I believe.
Well, and the other thing about being an assistant is you learned how to document everything, and that later, when you become a first engineer, is invaluable to understand that, because then you're able to teach it to your assistant. And proper documentation back then, before there were computers, that and good handwriting. And I think that's kind of when I aged out of my assistant, was when my handwriting began to deteriorate.
What I did was, it was rather interesting, because I worked at the company MCI that made the recorders and the consoles, and there was a 400 series console and a 500 series console, and I remember doing that documentation, and it was tough trying to remember. And you got to remember, this is all before automation where every, knob twist is recorded and be able to process. This was at the very infancy of fader movement and mutes, and I think that's all that we had was the fader movement,
Right.
and that was all based on a time code track, which was on track 24, and it ran off of the time code so that it knew where it was in the music. So I remember doing this over and over again. I'm saying, God, there's got to be an easier way. And I went to Mac, the studio owner. I said, I think I got a better way to document all these sessions, because every studio, we had a binder for every project. So there was a session binder with all the track sheets and all the notes and everything. But I came out with I had a friend I went to high school with that owned a print shop up in Fort Lauderdale. And I said, look, here's a picture of a channel strip, and I want to repeat that on a fold-out heavy paper cardstock. And I want it repeated by 32. I don't remember. Oh, this is a 48 was in D, a 48 input, right? And that was a 500.
I think that was the largest.
Yeah.
Right.
And I said, I want 48 channels, and I want a fan folded out to where, and I just want to take a red pen, and I want to mark the pan pod. I want to mark the button that was pushed. I want to mark, what the EQ setting was. And I came up with that system, which lasted forever, and it was great. And everybody kept, and you would have it for one song. And if there was changes, then you would have a revision of that same thing. But that's how our automation was. And those are things that I learned in the studio as an assistant. And I knew the other thing that was really good for me as far as an assistant goes, and again, I notice it working with a lot of younger engineers, is it's a gift to have the vision of a workflow. When Bruce said, look, I want to patch this limiter in here, and I want to bring it out there, and then I want to run it into the reverb, and then out of that into the lexicon. You got to kind of visualize it, with boxes, but the patch chords going in and knowing what he's doing, and if it's pre-fader, post-fader, you've got to know how to get all those patches in and do it correctly and fast. Because everybody's waiting. You got the guy sitting in the studio, and then Bruce just decides he wants to put I forgot what it was, 1176 or something.
1170, Yuri 1170.
Yeah, so, and so you got to get the patch cords, and you got to pull them out, and then you got to make sure that they all work, and you got to hope that the patch receptacle was clean, because they would be dirty because of the way the patch bay was set up was more on a flat surface, so dirt and cigarette ashes and all kinds of crap used to get in the patch bay, and you used to have to wiggle it and spray it with cleaner. And but those are things that I think putting a good 5 years into being an assistant or learning under somebody is really good. Well, anyway, I took all those stuff and I adopted it to working in the field, and I was pretty much the first one to start using studio mics out on location, and it's pretty much the norm today also. But we're talking in 78, 79, that type of thing.
Yep, a true pioneer.
Yes.
Well, I saw another interview you had done with In the Mix, and one of the things you said struck me so well is that the gift you have is to visualize signal flow before you even start acquiring the equipment. Mm-hmm. You can find out what the job is and visualize the signal flow. That's not a skill that I have. When I need to put together a system, I've got to sit down with a legal pad and a pen and sit here and draw the arrows. But I think that's such a valuable gift, and I know it's definitely served you well in your career with all of the major productions and the facilities you've worked at. That was an impressive skill to me.
Yeah, it was something that I to this day it's actually harder now because you got to kind of do it with Pro Tools, and I have an S3 and an iDock, and everything is invisible, so you really have to work at it. Whereas before, we have goes intas and goes out, you're easy to just attach an XLR to this and this. That isn't the same anymore, and it's in so many layers deep in Pro Tools. You really kind of got to hunt for it, and you got to understand where it goes. And a lot of people are really great at it. I'm not as good because I don't use it every single day, but we use a digital recorder. The one that I chose to use in the field is made in France, and they did a great job of building everything in this little box. I mean, it's no bigger than this big. It has 24 tracks. It has, I don't know how many inputs, 60 something inputs. It has AES in, it has mic in, it has line in, it has Dante audio. It has so many inputs, and you can feed them all in the box. And again, it's a matter of knowing where to look in the menu system to get the signal from AES 1 and 2 all the way over into a track, and then have it pre-fade back so that it can go back out and my crew can hear things. So it's a big grid, and that's the way we use it. And now, from this day forward, the system called Dante was implemented probably started showing up about 5 years ago, but it's made in the UK by Audient. Is it Audient?
Yeah.
And it's being built into every single audio piece of equipment nowadays. And it's 32 channels of audio on a Cat 6 cable. And with that, you're able to remote everything, run 2 Cat 6 cables, and you use 2 for redundancy. And, it's a whole different world. And you've got to go into a grid, and you've got to assign those channels. So, again, it's a similar system than it was, but with hardwire. And so it became pretty easy. And but because I haven't worked since December, so my mind is slipping. I'm getting anxious about getting back to work so I can start punching in my equipment and getting used to it again. But we work on a show, and it's a day-to-day thing, and it pops up pretty easy. I have no the recall on it's fast. So,
what's the name of that particular recorder?
The name of the recorder is Aton. It's made by Aton. They used to make cameras, and then they ventured over into audio recorders back in, I want to say, the early 2000s. And then they revamped the whole system, and now it's the hottest pretty much recorder. It's made in France. There's only 3 major manufacturers for digital audio recorders for the field. There's lesser, smaller ones, but the 3 majors are a company in Jersey named Zaxcom. There's a company in the Midwest, and they're called Sound Devices. They're very popular, very affordable. And there's the French one, which is the Aton, and they have 2 models, and it's called a Kantar. And the Kantar X3 is the big boy. And then they have a Mini, which only has 10 inputs, but has 16 tracks. So you can do a lot with those machines. I went with the French. I'm sort of liking the way the Europeans work sound more as I get older. Because the interesting thing, and I had a friend who I met, we became friends overseas from India and Bollywood, and I'm trying to think, Slumdog Millionaire. And I met him, and he owned a Zaxcom, and he got up every morning, got on the train because he had no transportation, carried his gear with him on the train, got off on location, did his location sound, excuse me. I'm sorry. I thought I muted everything. And he was able to mix, do the dialogue editing, where here in the United States, once my job's finished, I hand it over to post-production, and post-production takes it, and then they finish it. So there's a whole nother group of sound engineers that take it, which is another great field for audio editing and dialogue editing. But in Europe, they take the sound from the beginning to the end, all the way up until some people mix it, some people don't. They leave it for re-recording engineers. But it's a different way of doing it, which is nice because, I would be doing a scene and I know my take 3 is better than my take 1, but the director printed take 1. So, but I can go back and take 3 and steal some pieces out of it and make it work. Whereas, the guys in the post studios, they're not really sure. So
right, unless you pass notes along to them, or do you try and do that to keep them in the loop? Or?
Yeah, it depends on the project. Because of what we do, our schedule is we will be shooting, say, in July, August, September, October for 10 episodes of something, and then post doesn't come on until October, November. So their schedule is offset. So by the time we're done, they're just starting on working on the film, because picture editorial starts way ahead of the game. So they start working on picture, and then by the time we're done shooting, they've done episode 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then sound comes on, and they start cutting the dialogue all from my notes and everything. And thanks to metadata, all my notes are put into the machine now.
Right.
So they can open up through a series of software programs that are available. They're able to open it up and recreate the mix, all the tracks. So if I gave them, say, 8 tracks of dialogue, they would be able to open it up and remix the dialogue to what I had originally, and or take the tracks individually and cut the tracks together if one track sounded better than the other, if the wireless microphone on the actor sounded better than the boom, or if there was a lot of noise. There's so many plugins that they can get rid of a lot of the background noise. So giving them all those tracks and all that flexibility, and they stay in a room and they're locked in, and whereas every day we're at a different place doing it. And again, I got a lot of those chops from working remote gigs,
live recording, remote. Yep.
And again, when we rented out our remote trailer, we were the guys who set it up. We set the mics. We interfaced with the house mixer. We pulled splits from the mics back to the truck, and then the guest engineer would come, or the producer, and we would bring everything up on the board. We would label it and say, here's your, drums are all here. They're all subgrouped here. Here's your vocals. Here's your guitars. And everything was laid out. And the engineer, because he has no idea, he's never worked in the truck, so he would come in and expect everything laid out, and we would set it up and make it work. There's a few times where we engineered some of the projects, but for the biggest part was, we were the guys setting it up. So
right. So Chase, you got any questions for Joe here at this point?
Yeah, I do have some questions, and if I could take it back just a little bit to discussing your early transition from working with music and then going into working in production sound. And I'm just kind of thinking about this along the lines of, we have a lot of students, I'm sure, listening, and what would be helpful for them is, I think, maybe how that transition was. How did you feel about doing that? Was that, I imagine there's got to be like some level of uncertainty there. It's kind of, that's no small thing to go from one kind of end of the spectrum to something almost entirely different. And I feel like that's it's kind of a reality. A lot of students or people who are looking to get into audio are probably going to confront. So if there's any additional information or insight you would share about that, I'd be interested to hear.
Sure. I'll give you a brief timeline, and if I veer off track, just re-ask a question at some point. But in the very beginning of my career, I started out in live sound reinforcement, and similar to what Bruce did, and worked for a sound company that did all the local concerts in Fort Lauderdale. And did a little touring with a couple of bands that wanted us to go along with them. Started out there, and then I transitioned into at working at MCI, which, again, fortunately, I was in the right place at the right time, because MCI was in Fort Lauderdale, and I was able to work at the factory, where I met another gentleman who really liked tape machines, he was doing consoles, I was doing tape machines. And then we got into the remote recording business. So then, from sound reinforcement, I transitioned into engineering over at MCI, which again, they made analog multi-track recorders and analog mixing consoles. And they were, the thing about what the owner of the company did was he made them affordable to studios, and they started popping up everywhere. And the studio business started going crazy, because now they've had, multi-track machines, 16 and 24, and multiple inputs, and it was going nuts. And then that was the beginning of automation. So then I left my remote gig with my partner, and I got offered by a gentleman who was the studio manager of Criteria. His name is Jack Davis. And he called me up one day and he says, we're short an assistant. Would you mind coming in and assisting? And he knew I had a lot of experience, because with the remote recording truck, Mac we used to sub out from Criteria work for the truck. So I said, sure. And that's where I got my into Criteria. I just started working more and more jobs, and whatever the engineers wanted, I did. Some crazy stuff, or if it just meant being there 24 hours a day, we were there 24 hours a day. It was, you never say no. And being in my 20s, it was easy. I wasn't married, and I was single, and I was just pursuing my career. And then that went on for, I think, almost 10 years. And started getting calls to do audio for remote trucks. I got called for CBS to do a music piece in Orlando at Disney World for New Year's show that they do. So they pre-record all the music, and it was Charlie Daniels, and there was in front of the Magic Castle. So they wanted somebody to come in, mix the music for that on a remote truck, and then that went to tape, and then in New Year's they rolled that stuff in. So I got my feet wet with television and understood how, again, different television mixing is being an A1 for a truck, and every truck is different, and now the boards are all digital, of course. But that was a hard thing. And then I just kept on working more and more into television. And then at that transition from the record industry and the music business. And again, like I said, it was a tough call with CDs and not knowing what was going to happen. When I think, were you there when Mac called us all into his office and we're all sitting around, and he's got this big black box that Sony gave him, and it was a CD player, and
Right.
he held up the CD and he goes, "Okay, this is our future." And so I started seeing the writing on the wall because nobody knew what to do with it. You know, the Mac saw it as, "Oh no, there goes our lathe," because
Right.
we mastered to a lathe and
To cut vinyl.
to cut vinyl. And so being young, I had the opportunity of just saying, "Well, I'm going to try something different." And then I started doing more single camera shoots, film shoots, commercials and whatnot. And there was a music TV it was from England, and it was my first hand in music playback to film. And that was my first big taste of a multiple day. It was like a month, I think. Then I went from that, and then I went into another movie called Knights of the City. So now I started having to learn a whole different way of recording because in film production, you're a true mixer back then because you're only recording to one track. And that was a Nagra, and it had one mono track on 1/4 inch. And whatever you mixed, you were mixing for whatever they were going to do, and that's what they cut. Otherwise, they would redub all the audio that you had done if something was wrong with it. So again, adapting my chops I learned in the studio to what I do in the field was a big help. And did that big film in Fort Lauderdale. I found it on Amazon. It still exists. And then went merrily on my way to Miami Vice, and that was just a series of, who knew who, and I had the gear, I had the chops, there was nobody locally available, and so I got asked to do the show, and I was on it for 3 years. It actually ran for 5. There was a sound guy that was from New York that came down that did seasons 1 and 2, and then he left, and then I came in on season 3. So 3, 4, and 5 I was on Vice, and then that just kind of blew my career up from that point, and I've been with it every day. Now I'm trying to go back into the studio a little bit and do some little projects that pop up here and there, and so I keep my hands in on everything. Sports. I did every type of sport imaginable as an A1. Music, playback, live music record, Van Halen down in Hollywood Sportatorium. Just anything music and media involved. That's pretty much what my expertise was. And Miami Vice was a big music show. Although we didn't have much playback back then, they used a lot of it for mood music. And that's the beginning of the new wireless microphones, and all that stuff started exploding. And
that changed a lot of things in terms of production sound.
Yeah. And where we had 2 tracks on Miami Vice on a Nagra instead of 1 track, and it's where they introduced time code into audio back in the 80s. And we used time code, and it wasn't well received, but now it's sort of like everything goes without saying. Time code is pretty much standard for locking up picture to sound. And the best way that I use it to explain to students what time code actually is, if you can envision a gear like on a bike, and it's an electronic gear. So the sprockets have got to line up, and that's how you sync the picture with the sound. And a lot of students can visualize that and see that, okay, that makes sense. And that's how it's done pretty much. And all my gear is in Los Angeles right now. We were supposed to start a show with for ABC, and it was with Andy Garcia and Katie Seagal, and it's a new show, but we haven't heard anything yet. There was rumors of August 24th, but now that things are kind of changing, we'll see what happens. But that's in short how the transition happened.
So I guess part of the answer to that question, Chase, is that you need to be a jack of all trades.
Yeah, it sounds about right. Now, the other thing that, or maybe let me ask, it does sound like you've gone through quite a series of, changes and challenges. So I imagine that's, a personality kind of thing where you kind of enjoy the challenge of seeing like what's possible and kind of moving from one thing to the next.
Yeah, it is. I am the type of person or engineer that something new comes out on the market and I got to grab it. I'm the guy that goes ahead and tries it, and then once I try it, then I like it, and a lot of people follow suit. Multiple people like myself do different things, and everybody has the same end result, but it depends on which way you go down the chain. But a lot of it has to do with networking also. You really got to have a good attitude, a good personality. You got to be friendly, and you got to help. You got to want to help. A lot of people take it sometimes as they don't want to help as much. They're afraid of people taking their jobs away from them. And, I'm not going to be around forever, so you might as well, somebody calls and say, hey, how do you do this, or how do you do that, or what can I do? And, I'm always there with helping them out or telling them how to do it. And that seemed to help my career a lot.
Awesome.
Well, your career has been pretty amazing.
Thank you.
One of the things I wanted to talk about was the facility that you built or outfitted for Scrubs. You won an Emmy for your work on that show, and I think that show's a big favorite of a lot of people. But you want to talk a little bit about how you wound up building out that facility?
Yeah, it was interesting. Our producer, his name is Bill Lawrence. He's a brilliant man. He's, I think, great-grandson of Sarah Lawrence of Sarah Lawrence University, but his creative mind was nuts. And when I first did the pilot with him, he was this young, energetic. He came from Spin City. He was one of the writers, and he also was a writer on Friends. So he had his fresh ideas and everything, and that what he ended up doing was he was the first producer to come up with single camera comedy, whereas up to that point, most of the comedy series were all sitcoms where there was an audience and a laugh track, and he wanted to do something different. He wanted the same feel as that, and he wanted to not have an audience, and he wanted to add in his own sound effects. But and we shot it like you would shoot a movie, where you would just have one or two cameras shooting, versus sitcoms where they have 3, 4, and 5 cameras sometimes, because they all shoot it at one time and they move on. They shoot an episode in a day, whereas we shot a half-hour episode in 5 days. So the studio gave him carte blanche to do it, and it turned out to be very successful. It was new to a lot of people, and they didn't get it, but then after a while it hooked up. So when we came back from the pilot and we shot it in Los Angeles, there was a hospital. There were a lot of hospitals in Los Angeles that were abandoned because of scams or money issues, and a lot of them were privately owned. And there was this 4-story hospital that they found in a little town called Valley Village, and we took over the whole hospital, and we did everything in that hospital. The whole show was done in the hospital, except for the mixing of the music, and the show was done at Universal Studios, because you need to have, a correct sounding
Mix stage.
But we did everything. Even the editorial was set up so that Bill can go down and sit with the editors. We had 2 editors, and they would split odds and evens episodes. And we had all the rooms. And I think Zach is now doing a podcast about that on iHeart, all the different episodes and what happened. But, they even came to me, the producers came to me, and they says, well, we want to build an ADR stage. And I said, okay, fine, now let's go look at some rooms. And there were so many rooms. There were morgues downstairs. We shot every square inch of that hospital. And so we found an x-ray room, and we turned the x-ray room, because it was shielded and also muted quite a bit. We took over that room and made that an ADR room. So we even did the ADR. So while we were setting up on one scene, the actors would go down to the ADR stage, and I'd run down there. Eventually, there was a guy that came in. I actually got I interviewed over at Full Sail for a intern to come in and help out, and which he came in on his own dime. His name is Brent Finley, and he stayed a whole episode or season. I forgot what season it was, but he stayed with us. He was there every day, and it was on his own dime. But he graduated. I picked him out from a stack of resumes, and he worked out great. Now he's one of the main dialogue editors over at Universal Studios, because of this one chance he got working in the ADR studio stage at Scrubs. But I had antennas wired all over the every floor of the hospital, so that wireless-wise, the actors can walk everywhere they wanted to. I would never be in a shot, or we wouldn't interfere with the shot, because with comedy, a lot of it is improv, and they're always doing something different than they, that's planned. And that's why it made it a great show. And every time we moved to a floor, everything was already set up. I just moved into a room, we hid, we connected our antennas, and they were free to go and do whatever they wanted to do. And even when we went outside, we had antennas set up outside, because we always shot everything right by the hospital. We never got in trucks. Maybe a few times we went to different parks and shot things in different parks, but for the most part, they always built the hospital to be a different set, a bedroom set, or one of the apartment sets. We had a standing apartment set, but that's how we did it. We did it very economically, and it was a lot of fun to do. And it was probably the best 10 years of my life working on that show.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's great. Well, you've worked with a lot of my favorites. You've worked on Castle with Nathan Fillion, who's one of my favorite actors, and also you worked on Justified with Timothy Oliphant, who's one of my favorites too.
Yeah, that was I did a season 3 with that, and made friends with the producer, and then worked with the producer ever since. He's he's great. He's a great man. And I went from Justified to a show called Nashville in Nashville, which had a lot of music. And then at the very beginning was a friend of mine did the pilot, and then he didn't really want to do the show. So I kind of got in and got the show. I did it for 3 seasons, but I had the ability to set up the format and the way that the music was done, and we recorded. And again, we used a whole separate system, and that's where we really started utilizing Dante. We had QSC was a backer of the show who supplied all the speakers, and we carried it out as a live concert. And because of all the musicians that were playing on the show, they were all real studio musicians. And so, they wanted to play. They didn't want to play to playback. Right. But we did use playback for them so that they can hear the rhythm and keep the time so that they can cut into the music easily. So they played along with it, but yet they still played realistically. All the amps were hot, the guitars were hot, the mics were hot, and we used all the mics as hot, and we recorded all those into a separate system that Matt Andrews, engineer in Nashville, we used a Dante system with Pro Tools, and then we used the very first board that came out was, I think by JBL, had this Soundcraft Dante board, and that's what we used for all the music stuff. So every time there was a concert or something, that's what we used, and then I did that for 3 years. So it was kind
of a hybrid live instruments and playback.
Correct.
Which goes to show you that bleed can be your friend.
It can, and they did a great job of editing that. The music editors were great, and and whenever we did a piano or a solo, that was all recorded live. We always mic'd the piano and kept that isolated with PZMs or some sort of Shep's mic, and then the actors always sang to it live. I forgot where I went to after Justified, but my current project that should be coming out in November was with National Geographic, but now I think Disney Plus has it. It's called The Right Stuff, and it was a series based on the Gemini Mercury capsule, 7 astronauts, and then hopefully it'll go to a season 2, and I may be able to see a piece of that.
Well, that was a Thomas Wolfe book, right? The Right Stuff? Yeah,
they rewrote it for this series, which got more in detailed with the personal lives of the astronauts instead of the project itself. It was the husband, wife, the girlfriend, boyfriend. Now we're into this thing, and what do we do? So it really had a major impact on the lives of the astronauts, what they were doing. And again, they were pilots and not really astronauts, because there was no such thing as astronauts at that time. But that was a good project. That was done in Orlando.
Right. I was going to say you did that locally.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that, we on this program have talked so much about the scene here in Orlando. And it's funny that you live here and make most of your living in Hollywood. So that's kind of a juggling act. And you've also been splitting your time with Atlanta too, right?
Yeah, we just, before this, which is on the air now at Disney Plus, we did Amazing Stories. It was a Steven Spielberg original project done in the 80s. And they rewrote it and came up with new stories. And that we did 10 episodes of that in Atlanta. So I work in Atlanta, Nashville, New Mexico, California, and it's all great, great career stuff. I missed out a little bit on my daughter, who Grace, who was kind of brought into this world on Scrubs, and my daughter, I have 2 daughters, and she's called a Scrubs baby because all the babies that were born on Scrubs are Scrubs babies. And my oldest daughter is a Miami Vice baby. So the 2 biggest shows that I worked on, I I have two children. No, my
Got children to show for it, huh?
So, yeah, and my daughter Grace is going to be going to Rollins College, hopefully very soon once they figure out what they're going to do. So she's going to stay local.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Chase, got any more questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you see as far as, I mean, because you've seen a lot of changes, I'm sure, with, technology. Is there anything coming up you're excited about, or is there anything, interesting coming down the pipeline that you think is going to be like a game changer?
Yeah, I do actually, and a few of my peers have kind of gotten together, and like I mentioned to you, Dante is a game changer in our equipment that we're using nowadays. And the reason for that is because of this pandemic that we're going through, they're trying to figure out the best ways that we could work on the set without people getting sick. And they're wanting as few people on the set as possible. So normally I have a 3 to 4 person crew depending on what's going on that day. A few of us rebuilt our equipment packages to work in that manner. So to give you an example, they want the sound engineer off the set totally. And what they're trying to do is keep it to 50 people on set, including the actors, everything in front of the camera, and everything behind the camera. So they're trying to keep us off the set, but my boom operator has to be on the set, and possibly 2 boom operators. And my third person, who does most of the wiring on the actors, has to be close to set. So they want us offset, but they don't know if it'll be like in a truck outside the stage, which is funny because back in the beginning of time, Warner Brothers, they always had a truck outside of the set, and the cables ran into the truck, and the recordist was there because the machine was very loud and it was big, and what they did is they put it in a truck and they ran cables back to the set. And in this case, they want to move us someplace remotely, whether it's on another stage, in another room, in a truck, or outside. They want us away. And the problem with that is most of our gear that works is the wirelesses only have a range of so many feet. They don't work through brick walls too well, and they don't work miles away. So we've got to learn to split the equipment up now. So the equipment, our wireless mics, our audio feeds back, all of those items, and they're now going to be using Dante, and we're feeding all those, and then we just run the 2 Dante cables back to wherever we're going to be remotely, and then our video feeds from the set so we can see what's going on. So we'll have like about 4 cables running back to wherever I will be at, but we have to be set up and ready to go for that. And the only way to do that now is to be purchasing Dante-enabled equipment. And Electrosonics, which is one of our major suppliers here in the United States. There's Sony, Electrosonics. There's a company in Italy, Wizicom, and they're all putting Dante into their equipment so that we can remote the gear now. So that's what it may change to be. It may or may not, but we'll hopefully see once we go back to work if that's the way it's going to be. But we do have to separate our department somewhat.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's like a problem you would have never really thought it would come up, that something you'd have to solve, but here we are with it.
Correct. And I had originally always set it up, and I didn't use Dante. Like on Scrubs, we used to do it because on Scrubs, we used to go on the roof, And my room that I kind of based out of was on the fourth floor. So I had a 12 pair mult that I used to connect the wireless to my cart. And I used to drop the mult down through the window in the fourth floor and the cable up over the roof. And then we would put the wireless out on the roof of the hospital. And that's how I started doing it. And because 12 pairs were enough, it was 6, 7, 8 channels of wireless, and then the return feeds to the producer and my boom operator. So those feeds, you used a 12-pair remote with a cable was fine with a mil-spec cable connector on it, and the thing never failed. So I finally ditched it after probably 15 years of use and went to RJ Cat 6 cable, RJ45 connectors. We'll see how that works.
Well, I've covered just about everything. We usually ask our guests about their home studio setups and equipment lists, but having been in Joe's studio, we could be here for the rest of the week if Joe lists what he's got in that building. So.
The S3 I had, and we were using the S3 for ADR because we were doing with Brent, the gentleman I told you about, we were doing ADR for there was a show, I want to say it's not Scorpio, something else. It was like Cougar Town we did. So we had this gear left over, and it was in Los Angeles, and I just sold the booth. But we shut everything down, and I had the gear sitting in LA, and I said, well, let me check it. Let me see what I can use. So I ended up putting this studio together, and like I said, I got the iDock. I got an S3 here, Genelec speakers. On Nashville, I went and bought this Ampex 2-track because I had a bunch of tapes of mixes that I had done at Criteria, and I wanted to digitize them and archive them. So I'm going to do that and archive them all up to a cloud someplace so that I keep them intact. And nothing real fancy other than I got 3 monitors. What I do have is I have a trailer that's it's about 40 foot long, and it's a ADR studio. It used to belong to the Jonas Brothers, and I purchased it from them, and it has 2 booths in it and 2 studios, and it has the same Pro Tool setup as I have here. And what we did with that was I think it was One Direction, their 4th album. We did the vocal overdubs for Sony in that they were on tour. So what they would do is as they're on tour, they would do their rehearsal, and then they would have time between their rehearsal and showtime. So instead of going back to their trailers, they went in to the ADR or the voiceover trailer. We recorded their vocals. The tracks were already made. We recorded their vocals in the trailer, and then this way they cut time out of studio time. And we did it also for band Perry, and we did it also for a few other bands. Nashville loves it because the trailer just follows them around on tour and parks in between their buses, and then they come in, they do their thing, and so it worked out really well. So that's sitting here again because of our pandemic. It's normally housed up in Atlanta, but it's here in Orlando right now. But there's a website. You can go and see pictures of it at southeastaudioadr.com, and you can view the pictures of it. And you're also welcome to drop me emails if you guys got any questions. If there's any students or anybody that wants to know something that I may know.
And what's that email address?
Just Joe Foglia at gmail.com.
All righty.
That's my personal email. So,
Well, Joe, I certainly appreciate your time. I want to thank you for joining us on the Reel to Reel podcast. And thank you for being here, Chase.
Yes, thanks for participating. It was great talking to you and getting to meet you.
And I know Joe and I are working on some projects, trying to get a few other things going. So stay tuned for that.
likewise. And when everything's open, I'd like to come down to the library and check it out.
You betcha.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We have so much more in store coming up on further episodes. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube and follow us on your favorite podcast app.